Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Curious Minds podcast. This is episode 3, and with me today is Shannon Kraushar, who is going to talk with us all about tying knots and rope today, right? As I jokingly say, Shannon's a knitter. That is a big, huge thing on the internet these days, people knitting and crocheting, and we're going to talk all about what it takes to get started, what kinds of people do it, why they do it, how they do it, how popular it's getting again in today's culture, what are the advantages to it as a hobby, or even as a selling your products or Etsy shop, all that kind of stuff. We're going to get into all the details about tying knots and rope today on the Curious Minds podcast. As I said, this is episode number 3, and we're going to call this, which they'll find out later, Shannon, why we call this episode Just Let Me Finish This Row, which is something that if you are married to a knitter, dating a knitter, have hung around with a knitter, at some point you will hear the phrase, just let me finish this row. So we'll explain what that means a little bit later. But first, I want to welcome everybody into the Curious Minds podcast. If you haven't checked us out before, we have our goal is just to do interesting interviews with interesting people. Sometimes it's hobbies that they have that are fascinating. Sometimes it's a job that they had or a life experience that they had. Hopefully now you've already checked out our first and second episodes. The first one was all about the Second Amendment, and the second episode was all about librarians and libraries, public libraries, what kind of services they offer. So we're going to go to a hobby now, and we're going to work on knitting this month because it's a it's a very popular thing. Lots of people are doing it. So let me just start off by introducing Shannon Kraushar sitting across from me, and yes, it is a relation. She's my wife, and so we wanted to sit down and talk about her hobby because it's something that she's been doing a long time. So Shannon, a little bit about yourself. You grew up moving around a little bit. You finally settled into the area that we live in now here in West Virginia. And you were actually a congressional page in high school. Tell us about that. What's that like?
My junior year of high school in 1992 to 93, I was a U.S. congressional page for...
And what is that?
The page program doesn't exist anymore in the House of Representatives, but basically there were 66 teenagers. You had to be minimum 16 to 18 years of age. You had to be juniors in high school. There were 66 of us from 23 different states.
And you go and you work there in D.C.
Yes, we went to school at the Library of Congress from 6:30 in the morning to 10:30 in the morning.
Okay.
Taught by college professors, and then from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. or until Congress let out, we worked literally on the House floor,
taking messages,
delivering messages, raising and lowering the flag, gotcha. Taking legislature packets from one place to another. So
pretty fascinating and pretty in touch. I know I was not really into politics that much when I was little and when I was even a teenager until we started dating and we went down for an inauguration and you got to take me. This was pre-September 11th when security wasn't as tight, and you were able to, because you still knew a lot of the people, take me in some of the places the average people don't get to go, and I actually got to go sit down on the House of Representatives floor, and I was like, wow, it's overwhelming when you see it on TV and then you actually get to sit there and go, that's where the speaker is, or that's where other people are, and so pretty fascinating. And you were a good student in high school. I know you don't brag on yourself, but you were a straight A student in high school. This was something that you had to apply for.
Yes, we had to apply for it. You had to have a minimum of I think a 3.5 GPA. I don't exactly remember, but it was very competitive. For every one of us that got a slot, there were over 1,000 kids that were turned down.
And you had to, there were a lot of people that got there through connections.
Yeah.
But to be clear, my dad's friends with the senator kind of a thing. But you got there, you had no connections.
No.
You had to pursue your place.
Correct. There's the House chamber, and then there are Senate pages. I was a House page, and to get it, at the time I was 15, and I had just learned about the program on my own and followed and just went to a community meeting and met the member of Congress. And I applied, but had to be 16 at the time. So I reapplied the next year and just kept following him around to different community events, pestering him, saying hi. And that's because I was very not aggressive, but very
vigilant.
Vigilant. Yeah. He recognized my enthusiasm, and for that, I earned my spot.
Yeah, very cool. And you have tons of neat memorabilia about that, and just a great life experience, right? I mean, people that you get to meet, and it also exposes you to, okay, it's not all the glamour that it's supposed to be, but it's interesting. But you got to see a little bit of the soft underbelly, the little ugliness and the little quid pro quo that goes on, and all the dealings that happen, which is not always portrayed in the beginning. When you see this, we think of our government as, this moral and upstanding, and you go, okay, I mean, there's a little sneaky going on. There's a little, you pat my back, I'll pat your back kind of a thing.
Yes, it was definitely in a different era than now. Like I said, the page program ended, I believe, in 2011 for the House side. There are still Senate pages, but not House pages. And there aren't as many Senate pages.
Gotcha.
So, and the House pages were separated into both Republican and Democratic pages.
Gotcha.
So whatever our member was whatever side of the House.
And you lived down there through the week. Some people went home on the weekends, or most people stayed?
Occasionally, people who live locally could go home on the weekends, but we did have school stuff and different activities we had to do.
Gotcha. So. And then you came back and graduated from high school, spent a little time going to Shepherd University, but, it was college back then. Didn't finish at Shepherd, but we, soon after that, we got married. We had our kids 7 years later, and you quit work to stay home with our kids.
I did.
Because that was important to both of us. So was the money, but more important was suffering through without your salary to raise the kids. But what was great about that was that our kids got raised by mom and not by anyone else. But
and I'm very grateful for that experience and opportunity. We're very lucky in the fact that I was able to do that. Yeah,
and luck is a big part of it. I mean, I have a good enough job that I could support us, although, I'm commuting a long distance to make, our money goes further in West Virginia than it would if I worked where I taught. But also that the reason I bring that story up is not yay for us so much as to suggest that without you staying home, you may have never picked up your hobby.
Oh, I absolutely would not have. Yeah. Being a stay-at-home mom when you're used to working 40 hours a week is definitely a different environment.
A big adjustment.
It was a very big adjustment for me. So when our son was a little over a year, I was starting to get stir crazy. You can only do so much cleaning and dishes and laundry and, taking care of the child. But when he's napping, you needed something to do.
Well, and also you need to exist for you.
Yes.
And you were always very work oriented. You identified very much with what you did for your job.
Yes.
And no matter which job it was, that was part of your personality. And when you lose that, you felt a little lost.
Yeah.
And so, although yes, I'm a mom, but what am I besides a mom? And without your career, there was a little bit of sort of refinding. What am I going to do? And not that you had oodles of extra time, but there needed to be something else that you put effort into that brought you satisfaction as much as...
Yeah, I wanted something for me, and I always enjoy learning. So growing up, my dad was very much craftsy, I would say. He was always painting or drawing or cross stitch. So I was kind of exposed to quite a few different crafts growing up.
Right.
And so my great grandmother crocheted. She passed away shortly after we got married, so I really wasn't old enough or didn't take an interest at that point in crochet. But knitting always just appealed to me. So one day we went to Michael's and I just bought a kids kit, just a little craft kit, and it had a little tiny bit of yarn, some plastic needles, and paper directions.
Well, and now let me interrupt you. Where did the thought of knitting first pop into your head, do you think? Like, where did you go, oh, that sounds like something fun, as opposed to painting or as opposed to any of the other things you just mentioned? Why knitting? I
think I saw the little craft box in Michael's and went, oh, okay, well, let's give this a shot. And it was, you could make, I think it was a purse for a doll or a little mug, rug, or a coaster, basically.
Gotcha.
And I thought, that's cute.
Is that a term they use, mug rug? Mm-hmm. That's cute. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Coaster. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Why not? I'll give that a try. And if I don't like it, I think the kit was like $10.
Yeah, it's only $5.
Yeah, only five.
We have a joke in our family because my dad and mom were very, like, we didn't grow up with much, so they're always very conservative about saving everything, and you have two things left, we'll wrap that up and put it away. Whereas my wife grew up with, that's all that's left, we'll just throw it away. And so my dad would always tease anytime you'd throw, it's only a couple paper towels. It's only $5. We'll just get another one. It's only $5. So that's an old line from my dad when he was around. So you pick it up, you take it home, you try it out.
I did.
Did you have success right away?
No, actually, the paper directions were very complex, but so I decided, okay, well, this looks interesting, and I still want to accomplish it. How do I do it the appropriate way? So at that time, there were a series of books for dummies. That was like the big thing.
Yeah, the black and yellow,
yes,
whatever for dummies
yes.
books.
So I went into, I think it was Barnes & Noble or one of the local bookstores, and just picked up a copy of Knitting for Dummies and decided, what do I need? So I went and I got a pair of wooden needles at the time, went to AC Moore, I think was the place, and a skein yarn. Had no idea what I was doing.
Right.
Started reading the book and realized, okay, I can do this.
Did you start off, were you nervous to go in and pick something out? Did you ask anybody for help, or were you more ashamed of showing your ignorance? So you just grabbed something and got out quickly?
Yeah, because it was in the beginning a little overwhelming, I just kind of was like, okay, well, this looks pretty. I can, maybe I'll make a square out of it.
Gotcha.
So, and I just took a pair of needles, again, not knowing anything. And this was before the widespread availability of the internet. So before YouTube, this was, I want to say 2000.
I was going to say, our son was born in 2005.
Correct. So this was like 06.
07. So things were out there, but it wasn't nearly the community that there is now.
Correct.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. So still the best way to get what you needed was to go to your local yarn store, a Hobby Lobby,
correct,
someplace like that.
And I had no
Michael's.
idea what I was doing. So I just, like I said, went to AC Moore, the craft store, which my dad used to get, again, a lot of his cross-stitch stuff. So I went, okay, so I could do this. And it was neat. I started learning in the book how to cast on, how to do the knit stitch, how to do the purl stitch, and I just follow the directions in the book. Nowadays, if somebody said to me, I'd really, really like to learn how to knit, my resource would be to send them either to a local craft store like Joann's or Michael's for like $25 or $35. They have learn to knit classes on different days.
Like in the evenings, and adults go in and they sign up and say, I'd like to learn, just like they would do for sewing or clothes making or anything.
If you're hands-on and you do better in a one-on-one environment, seeing somebody actually physically do it, if you don't know anybody who actually knits, that would be my recommendation. Or a local yarn store. So local yarn stores that actually sell, besides a big box store, I would try there. If not, YouTube. Yeah. YouTube is amazing.
And you had, before you got into knitting and all that, you were sort of familiar with retail. You had worked at Target as a department manager, and there you were in charge of the boys, girls, and infants, right?
Yes.
So, and that was part of what was fun too about when the kids came, because you already knew, like, we want this stroller, not that stroller. We want this seat, not that seat. Because you learned it all to know it for work.
Correct.
And did you have anybody that you worked with at Target that knitted that you knew of?
No.
So it wasn't something where you saw that was where you worked the longest before you stopped working. But there was nobody that, like, you said, I've seen what that person can do, and if they can do that, I probably could too.
I think there was a friend of ours' wife that I saw making a scarf one time. She was just knitting, like the knit stitch. And just to do the knit stitch is called garter.
Right.
But I don't remember asking her much, but I remember seeing her do it.
Gotcha.
We weren't very close.
Kevin's wife?
It was Kevin's wife.
Okay.
So,
but yeah, we didn't see them very often,
no,
so you didn't get a chance to really interact.
No, so when I went into AC Moore or Michael's, I just went, this looks neat, and I had remembered her doing it, but I just decided to try something new. So,
now you're home. Where we jumped a little bit ahead about where we would go for people that are doing it now, but just to backtrack a little, you're now home. You aren't working your 40 hours a week plus the commute back and forth to work. You have a baby. Now you have two babies as of 2009. One is 5 and one is 4 or 6 months. And you have this hobby which grew and grew and grew because you could pick it up. I presume one of the reasons it was a great hobby, you can pick it up and put it down at will.
Yes. And a lot of knitters, including myself, will take it with you. So I currently am back to work and I will take it, and during my break times I'll just knit a few rows. So it's very relaxing, it's very portable, it's relatively inexpensive as far as hobbies go. It can get a little pricey with certain yarns, but for the most part, if you're going to start off, it can be very, very inexpensive.
Well, and the thing, you say that it's relaxing. When I watch you do it, it looks neurotic because it's this repetitive.
Yeah.
You're fast at it now, but it's a very repetitive technical, but you'll do it and watch TV, you'll do it and watch, and this is the phenomenon we'll get to in a little bit. Even though you were stuck at home, not alone, you had children, but not adult interaction.
Correct.
For most of the day, you found some ways to interact with adults, or at least listen. You would knit and you would sit and watch a podcast about a person who knitted. And this is the part that as I'm starting this Curious Minds podcast, and I look at, it boggled my mind that not that it's not a talent, not that it's not interesting, but I thought, I'm trying to get this podcast rolling, and I go, man, some of these knitting podcasts have 60,000 subscribers, and all they do is they get on and they talk about what they're working on. They talk about, it's just not ridiculous in a bad way, but ridiculous in a surprising way, a ridiculously large community online. And we're going to talk a little bit about more of that in the future. But that was one of the things where I went, my goodness, this is a whole community. And again, through the pandemic, that was something
it's no longer your grandmother, your 80-year-old grandmom sitting there knitting a sweater for you. The average age, I think, is men and women in their 30s and 40s.
And we see things cycle for sure in life. And it seems like knitting and crocheting is making a big comeback. It's not very unusual now to see a 35-year-old woman in a knitting store getting needles or getting yarn. So we'll talk a little bit about more than that. And you even take it with you, like our one child is marching band, and so we'll go to a football game, and you're not necessarily interested in the game so much. You watch the kids play on the field, but you're sitting there in the stands. If it's a pretty night, you can knit. We can watch the football game. So it's something that's very portable, like you said. You can take it with you, and before a concert, we went to see our son in a concert last night. If you wanted to, you could have carried it in. It's unless you're knitting an Afghan, it's small enough you can carry with you and work on something.
Yeah, I love the portability, and it's relaxing, and I can actually concentrate. A lot of knitters say we can concentrate more on what we're doing if our hands are occupied. So I can knit without looking. You learn with practice. So it's our comfort.
Well, of course, yeah, for sure. And so you came to it through that luck of the draw. It was just something that, had you seen a show about it? You saw a person knitting, and then you saw the kit, and you just picked up the kit and said, I want to give this a try.
Yep.
And we're going to do somewhere later in the podcast, we're going to insert, I'll overlay a video of you doing different stitches, because just to show beginners how to get started and how they might want to do it, just so that people who are technical can know the difference between a knit stitch and a purl stitch and all these other kinds of things that even I don't know about at this point, which is why we're doing the podcast. Now, how long have you been doing it then overall?
Well, our son will be 19 here soon, so almost 18 years.
Yeah.
So. And
how much better have you gotten in that time? And what constitutes getting better at knitting? Like how do you measure, that's good knitting versus, okay, that's beginner level knitting?
I would say just experience. So the longer you do it, the quicker you can become, the more complex things you can make. Really, in knitting, you have the cast on, you have the knit stitch, you have the purl stitch, and you have the bind off. If you can do those 4 things, you can learn a series. All knitting is a combination of knit and purl stitches.
Okay.
So you can add extra yarn in and do fair isle. You can...
What's fair isle?
Fair isle would be this. This is an example of fair isle knitting. So stranded knitting. So it is literally creating patterns with using yarn.
And that has to do with the color of the yarn, obviously, but then when you knit, when you purl.
Correct.
So it's literally just a combination of types of stitches.
Correct. And this is all knitting.
What is that, by the way?
This is a cowl. This is an actual for your neck. So
gotcha.
So
what a guy would call a neck warmer.
Yes.
A neck sock. And what's the technical name?
A cowl.
Okay.
COWL.
Okay.
So, and like, you can use the different stitches to create different patterns. So this is a hat that I've made.
Angle that back just a little so that there we go. So you can see, and you can even move it a little closer to the camera so we can see the little, and what are the little bumps that we're seeing? Hold it up a little higher.
It's a daisy stitch.
Gotcha.
But again, it's just where you use the knit and purl stitches.
I gotcha.
So that's all cabling.
What about the thing on the top? Did you make that or do you buy those?
Nope, I made it. It's called a pom-pom. Mm-hmm. You can get a pom-pom maker by Clover, and you just wrap yarn around and then cut it and tie it.
And it creates all the ends like that?
Mm-hmm.
Or okay, very cool.
Needs a little haircut in it.
And then you sew it onto the top of the hat after it's done. Not sew it, but knit it on.
Correct. Yeah, okay. You sew it on the top.
Now, how do you create, like around the bottom there where there's almost the band, how do you create, like that's theoretically like the elastic part, right?
Correct. But
that's not elastic. That's all the same kind of yarn.
No, this is all the same yarn. So you cast on at the bottom, and this is what they call a rib stitch. It's knit 2, purl 2. So, and that brings the fabric in and gives it stretch, and then you create whatever if you want to do a solid beanie, you could just literally do the knit stitch in the round.
So it would just have those grooves all the way up to the top.
Correct.
That's cool. Because I've definitely seen hats. Didn't you make me one that was like that?
Okay. A ribbed hat. If you wanted to make a ribbed hat, you could just knit 2, purl 2 the entire thing.
Okay.
Decrease and bind off.
And we'll talk about what decrease and bind off looks like when we do our segment video. Essentially, decrease is how you take something that's a larger diameter and bring it down to a point. You're just taking out one stitch.
Correct. And if somebody actually really truthfully YouTube, it is amazing space. I would recommend, there's a lady called Very Pink Knits podcast. She has tutorials on every single stitch you want to learn.
Shout out to the Very Pink Knits. maybe if we tag her in this we'll get a little pub. No, I'm just kidding. But I know you depend on your online community
absolutely,
because
even though I've been doing it for 18 years, if there is a pattern and I'm unsure of a stitch in a pattern or series, I just look on YouTube, and literally people do this and they record how to do that.
So Very Pink Knits is the name of a channel.
Yes, she has her own podcast.
Okay, and she does like instructional tutorials?
Correct. So she'll take patterns and break them down and say, okay, to do rib, you have knit 2, purl 2, knit 3, purl 1. She literally breaks down patterns and shows you in slow motion how to do it.
Gotcha.
There are different ways to cast on. There are different ways to bind off. There are different, that
creates different looks to your design.
Correct. And so she then takes those and breaks them down into a video series and shows you how to do them.
Gotcha. Very cool. And once you learn, so essentially what I'm hearing is there are 4 slots to plug things into: the cast on, the knit, the purl, and the bind off.
Correct.
And within that, there are different ways to do each of those 4. So it's how you mix and match all of those things that creates the uniqueness of any piece of knitted artwork or clothing.
And she breaks it down even if you want to knit a sock, on a series of how to knit a sock.
Yeah.
How to start, how to cast on, how to knit all the sections of the sock, how to bind off. So she's an amazing resource as far as tutorials.
Does she show you how to make socks for your husband and only for your mother-in-law? Or for your mother? That's a joke in our family. My wife makes socks, and they're wonderful wool socks. Yes. They end up being about $30 a pair in yarn expense because she buys really, really good yarn. But the funny part is she's made her mom, 25, 28 pairs?
A lot.
And good old hubby here, who up until recently when wifey went back to work, honey's paying for all the yarn, gets 2 pair of socks. That's it. Cold feet the rest of the month.
You have a size 14 men's foot versus, a lady's
It's not
9.
my fault. Not my fault. So just take 2 of her socks and sew them together. Anyway, no offense, Grammy. You get all the socks. That's fine. What satisfies you about the process of knitting? Like when you sit down, you said it relaxes you. Besides sort of that tension release, what satisfies you?
It's getting a creative element out. So it's literally, for me, it's the process of learning something new or having a finished item at the end. So for example, this was one of my favorite little things I made our kids, a little stuffed.
Is that where the wild things are?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I learned different techniques through making them and sewing on different buttons. This is our son's from many, many, many years ago. I'm going to show you.
Yeah, and you buy the safety eyes, and they're made in a way that they can't come off, so
Correct.
they're not a choking hazard.
Correct.
And the buttons and all those things are made in a way that they're child safe.
Correct.
And one of the things that you said you wanted to do too was to even make some of these, now that our kids are older, to give away to kids like at children's hospitals, or just,
or even to give them to police officers and firemen, so when they come upon a scene and the kids are already traumatized by whatever's on the scene, if they could hand them out just a stuffed animal to give the kids some comfort in a uncomfortable situation.
And you never know how, that can affect. We have one family member who you made a bunny for.
Yeah.
And that little girl has had the bunny for how many years now?
A good 10.
And still, according to her mom, she carries it everywhere. Well, I mean, not everywhere at this point.
But when she was little, that bunny went on school field trips. That bunny went on picture day. That bunny, to the point where the bunny needed washed many times. So the mom called me and said, "I'm afraid to do this. How do I do it safely? Because if something happens to this, it's not going to be good."
Right.
And so I reassured her how to wash it, but also told her, since the child loved it so much, I could remake it if something happened to it. But yes, we do have a family friend whose daughter just absolutely fell in love with her bunny. And still, to this day, she's a teenager and it still sits on her bed.
Right. Yeah. And that's got to make you feel special.
It does.
Because you brought some joy in, and for, $15 or $20 in yarn and a few hours of your time and some polyfill, you can make something that's unique that she can't buy anywhere else.
Correct.
And none of her friends are going to have one too, and it'll be something she can keep forever, and it's the only one in the world.
Correct. And for me, my knitting is how I show love.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of knitters will sell their items or sell their patterns. I personally just knit and give away 95% of my knits. I think I've got a handful of socks for myself.
Yeah.
Because it brings me joy to knit for others. I'm thinking about whatever I'm creating. I'm thinking about the person that I'm creating it for. And so it just gives me, it's act of service and act of love. So it just brings me joy to make things for others that they would appreciate.
And also the things that you make, are not necessarily... Yes, could you use some of those things, coasters or coffee or a coffee holder? You could, but for you, the process is more important than the item.
Oh, absolutely.
So you're not in it like because you want the product. You're in it because you enjoy the process.
Correct.
And so by giving things away to other people, you get the joy of the creation, and they get the joy of the product.
Correct.
Now, we talked about whether we approached this or not, but you said it was okay. You also have a little bit of anxiety.
I do.
And how would you say that knitting works with your anxiety? In other words, how does a lot of people in the world today are dealing with the speed, the pace of the world, and knitting is a very quiet personal activity.
Yeah.
It can be interactive if you're in a group, but it's a very solitary, I'm focused right here on my hands.
Correct.
And how does that help you with your anxiety?
It brings me peace. When the world seems overwhelming, it just absolutely brings me peace, and I relax and concentrate. I can tune out the rest of the world. I can just concentrate on my knitting. And I found from my own mental health that when I take a break from knitting, or if I don't have time in my physical schedule to knit, I can feel my anxiety. It builds up, and then I go, oh, I haven't knit in a while. I just pick up my needles, and it's an instant. I have a cup of coffee and my knitting needles, and life is good.
Yeah, it's sort of a Calgon take me away
really
moment
is.
for you.
Even if it's 20 minutes, you don't need hours to do it. Even if it's a 20 minutes, I'm going to knit 2 rows,
And here's what I notice as your husband. It forces you to slow down.
Yes.
Because you tend to go from one activity to another sometimes at a frantic pace, and at a pace that's not healthy for you. Yeah. And so you get yourself in as a whirling dervish, and you're moving around so quickly, and this forces you to take 5, sit down, focus on something right in front of you. It sort of, like you say, it reduces the lens of life that you're looking through to a focus of right here, and it's right in your hands. And I see that with you when you have time to knit, you're much calmer, you're much happier than when you don't. When you go 3 or 4 days and you haven't had time and things have been busy, you get agitated. Yeah. Like, it's something that I see make a difference in your life too.
Yes, so, this is definitely my comfort. So.
Now, you showed us a couple of the things that you got there. Are there any other things that you've made that you brought to show, or just mostly? Is that most of the stuff?
It's most of what I brought.
And what about?
This is a sock that one of a pair that I made, and like I said, you can do this is self-striping yarn.
Doesn't look my size.
It's not. It's mine. One of the few socks I keep for myself. But there are different types of yarn, and different types of needles, and that's what I was going to kind of go into. I'm going
to ask you about that too. Now, before we get there, what can you think of anything, even if you don't have it in front of you, that you've made? You've made socks. You've made scarves.
I've made.
And you were quick. I'll tell the story while you're thinking. Sorry. One day, all the teachers at my school. I'm fairly big. I'm almost 6'4", and all the teachers at my school decided for Halloween our team was going to dress up like the Minions and Gru. And I had a black jacket and black pants. They said, "Can you be Gru?" So I said, "Sure," but it was last minute notice, and they all got yellow T-shirts and jean overalls. And I said to my wife, "Can you make me Gru's scarf?" I'll throw a picture of it here for those of you that aren't familiar with the character Gru from the Minions movies, Despicable Me. And so I said to my wife, "Can you make me that black and gray scarf?" And she's like, this was Friday, I think.
This was a Friday.
And I said, "They just told me this idea. Can you make?" She says, "By when?" I said, "By Monday." And she says, "Let me run to the store." And we just needed cheap yarn, and you knit it with big gauge. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. So you knitted out a scarf and you say scarves are supposed to be as tall as the person.
Yeah, as long as you are tall, right, is the standard.
So she made me a scarf that was as long as I was tall within 2 days over the weekend, and then I was able to go, and if I can find the picture of it, I'll share it here, of me dressed up as Gru with my wife's scarf and the members of my team, all dressed as Minions, which was a cute thing for their middle school kids to see us on Halloween dressed all alike. So scarves and hats you've made, and
yes. So when I was beginning knitting, everybody got a scarf because
for Christmas,
Christmas, because that's kind of what I did. Washcloths, different baby hats, baby blankets, baby shawls, prayer shawls, blankets.
The thing with the washcloths is they're so thick and lush that you almost feel bad using them.
Yes.
Because you go like, my goodness, this is not like a cheap $2 washcloth from Walmart. This thing is really like, I don't want to use this because it's actually, but they hold up. I mean, they're knitted. Correct. And they're made to last. So What else?
I've toys, tons of toys over the years, and that is socks. I gotta say, after many, many, many years, I gravitate now. When the kids were younger, it was toys, all about the different toys. The kids would come home and go, "Mom, can you make me?" And I would find a pattern, and I would make it from a BB-8 to a big elephant, giraffe, whatever.
Yeah, you made all kinds of stuff. And then you'd also make like Christmas tree ornaments.
Yes.
You would do your share of, we'll bleep out the name here, Disney, Isney Day, Altway Isney Day. But you could do Mickey and Minnie ornaments you sent to some of our friends who are Disney-aholics. And so you were able to sort of come up with some ideas to copy things you saw online.
Well, and when the kids were little with the animals, I used to donate at Christmas time a set of books and an animal to go with the books.
Right.
So for each child, like one of our daughter, I believe, was in kindergarten at the time, and it was if you give a mouse a cookie.
Right.
And so I had made a set of mice with the bib overalls and everything. And the kids, what was great was the teacher used it as a motivational tool to teach the kids how to read. So they would actually read to the mice to get the kids who were shy So it was great. And the teachers loved it. So year after year, the word got around who was going to get what book and what stuff.
And the teachers would reach out to their kids and say, "Would you ask your mom if she would?" Or they'd see you at a PTA meeting or at a back to school night, and they'd be like, "I hear you make," and then could you please?
Yes, and I've made hats and scarves and fingerless mitts and different washcloths, and so I'm constantly doing stuff and donating it. But I personally haven't made sweaters just because it's not something that interests me.
Right.
But I've made pretty much everything else.
Well, and also, so here's the dilemma when we talk about yarn. You can buy very inexpensive yarn,
Correct.
and you can make yourself a $50 sweater with inexpensive yarn. And I'm not this, regardless of the size of the person you're making the sweater for. But if you go and make a really nice sweater, you're going to end up having hundreds of dollars in yarn in that sweater.
Correct.
And so,
Especially if it's wool.
and you have to decide, okay, do I really need a $200 wool sweater?
Right.
Or is that a little, and for some people that's fine if they're willing to put that much money in and they last them a long time. For you, you're a little more practical than that.
Yeah,
so you're
it's not something I would wear all the time, so therefore,
Right.
for me, socks. So my latest obsession is socks. Sock
Yeah.
yarn. I'm making socks for my mom. I'm making socks for the kids because they're an everyday item and they're just amazing.
And we touched on this, or we're kind of broaching this topic now, but your favorite things to make, the toys, right, by far? Or has that changed?
That has changed. I would say socks now. When the
Really?
kids were little, it was definitely toys because I just love to see the little things.
Yeah, when you give it to them.
You give it to them, and just to see the kids' reaction, whether it's a friend of a friend, our niece, nephews, or our own kids, to see the kids squeal with delight when they got their newest stuff, lovey, that I made. That's the best. Mm-hmm. But for me, socks now. Now that the kids are older.
Is it because they're kind of straightforward, or is it just because they're practical? Like what makes socks so
great?
For
socks, it's because they're portable, straightforward. I can pick them up. I don't need polyfill and a bunch of little safety eyes and stuff like that. And honestly, we're just in a different season of life.
Okay.
So our children, if I still had little, I'm going to love, again, when we have grandchildren, going back to the stuffed loveys
Right.
and spoiling them rotten. It's just that we're in a different season of life. So for now, everybody needs socks. Everybody loves socks. So that's my go-to. And
I love socks.
Yes, I know. And I'm currently working on a pair for you.
Least favorite things to make. Are there any that you're like, if somebody asked you to make them this, you'd be like, oh man, I'd do anything I'd make you anything else. But
honestly, just knitting with black yarn, mostly because it's hard to see.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's not just myself. A lot of knitters, we do it, but it's just like one of those, because
that
they're
makes
very
sense. You
hard
can't
to
see the different strands. You can't see where you're putting your needle through.
Correct.
That makes sense. I never thought about that.
So if somebody asks for a really wool hat that's fingering weight, which is a thinner wool hat in black, I'm going to love you a lot to do that.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What kinds of yarns are there? Like fingerling, what does that mean?
Okay, so yarn starts out, and again, you can use different resources for this, from 1 to 6 as far as the thickness of it. And you find that, I don't know whether I have anything, yeah. So on the back of, this is a skein of yarn. This is a skein of 150-gram ball of fingering weight.
And is that how they measure by weight usually?
They measure by weight.
Okay. Because why?
They measure by weight and thinness. So the thinner the yarn, that's a 1 versus a 6, which is a bulky.
Well, why don't they measure like this is 750 yards of yarn?
Well, they do. They actually break it down. So this is 231 yards for 50 grams.
Okay.
So they do break it down for you, but what I was going to say is this is a 50-gram ball of fingering weight, and if you see on the ball band, I don't know if it'll show you, there's a 1 in there.
Okay.
So to indicate that
is in the box?
I
can see the box.
It is.
Yeah, it's not quite close enough, but that's okay.
It is. So it'll tell you when you go to pick up a skein of yarn at a local box store. And that's where things I did not know. So yarn has labels, and in the labels it'll tell you the material that's in it. So if it's acrylic or wool or bamboo or cotton, it'll tell you the material, it'll tell you the yards. So if you're making a sweater or a garment that you needs to fit. So you need to know how many yards are needed in the pattern. The pattern will tell you.
Oh, I was going to ask how you know.
So you need to know. Another thing that most crafters, when you're first learning, you don't know, is that unless it is a non-dye lot group of yarn, in other words, a yarn that is mass produced where there is an individual, like in massive bulks, each is in a smaller batch, and especially in the big box stores, they have dye lots. So that's numbers that are on the side here.
Gotcha.
And so again, if you're making a sweater or a scarf or something that uses multiple skeins of the same color, you want to buy the same dye lot. So because even though they're dyed the same, they can be off just a little bit.
Kind of like if you're painting a big enough room and they say mix the gallons of paint together so that you get an average of all the slightly different, just could be a tiny variation. But if you do one sock in one skein, or the first 6 inches of a sweater in one skein and then another, it could be off enough that you could see a difference.
Correct. It'll be color blocked. You'll actually be able to see the lightness and darkness in that.
Gotcha.
So in fact, so these are big box store yarns. Okay. So again, you can walk up and they start with lace weight or fingering weight, which is really, really thin, all the way up to a 6, which is bulky. So
now, would you ever make are certain weights for certain projects? Would you make a sweater out of fingerling?
Oh, 100%. Yes and no. So you can pretty much make anything out of any type of yarn. Okay. It goes by the pattern. So whatever the pattern says on the weight of yarn, typically socks are knit in a fingering weight if you're going to wear them with shoes. But you can make DK weight.
So that it doesn't throw off the size of shoe you'd need to be too thick.
So, and you can make sweaters in fingering weight. You can make sweaters in bulky. It depends. The thinner the yarn, the more yarn you need.
Of course.
So it depends on the pattern, So again, the numbers on the labels in big box stores will tell you 1 is fingering and they kind of break it down. Okay. 2 is like sport, 3 is DK, 4 is worsted, 5 is like a bulky. So they go all the way up to 6, I believe. Okay. So, and again, if you see a pattern, it'll kind of tell you worsted weight yarn or bulky yarn or fingering yarn. So you kind of know, oh, okay. And then it'll give you a little box with like little knitting needles or a crochet hook that'll kind of give you what they call a gauge.
So once you pick the diameter of the yarn, for lack of a better term, the weight, what else affects your choices of yarn? Like what else you look for? You mentioned, I think in there somewhere, you mentioned something about what it's made out of.
Correct. So, well, that's very important. So, for example, socks.
Well, that's why I asked it. I'm here on the Curious Minds podcast. We want to get all the hard-hitting questions.
For example, it depends upon the product that you want in the end. So, for example, socks. If you want socks that are going to last, that are going to be in a shoe and take some friction, you're going to want some wool and nylon blend socks. So that's going to be, again, a wool nylon blend yarn.
Okay. As opposed to, say, cotton, which
As
would fret.
opposed to, say, acrylic.
Okay.
Which is a man-made plastic.
Okay.
And essentially wool absorbs the sweat off your feet, and to keep your feet warm and cold, where plastic actually gets your feet hot and sweaty.
And probably retains the moisture.
Correct. Okay. And it gets funky.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
And so it's
like having your hand inside of a rubber glove.
Correct. So it depends on kind of the use of what you're trying to do to determine what yarn. Also, some of it is preference. So for example, in sweaters, you can make a cotton sweater. If you live in the South, you're not going to want a wool sweater. Right. So it depends upon where temperature at and kind of what you want to make.
Gotcha. So size, diameter of the yarn, material in the yarn. Is there a quality of yarn, or is it mostly? Yeah. Like, how do you know? What other factors go into picking a yarn?
Well, preference, quality. As far as quality goes, it really almost comes down more to preference. So there are big box store yarns, the stuff you could get at Joann's, Michael's, Walmart, and then there are what they call indie dyed yarns, and these are literally little moms and pops, little moms and dads that are
about grandmoms?
Well, grandmoms. They're small business. They're a small business owner, and so they create yarns in smaller batches that are specifically dyed by them.
Now, I'll show my stupidity. You get wool from a sheep. You take the wool from the sheep. You spin it into a string.
Well, it needs to be processed. There's a huge amount of process to go from the wool to
what I'm saying is you have the material.
Yes.
My picture, the old days of the spinning, okay, and then it turns into the thread that
Correct.
you use.
And then you have to ply it. So there are many plies. Plies are how many strands of yarn there are together. So, for example, I think this one's a 3 or 4 ply.
Like rope, because rope has many different strands within the one rope. Okay.
And the more strands you have, the stronger it is. So it's not going to like pull apart, snap, and the plumper it is. So the more stitch definition and stuff like that. Okay. But as far
I must have a lot of strands in me. I'm fairly plump. Anyway, so you pick that, and what I think you were saying is that you can buy different types of yarn, and then the indie dyers, more expensive, I'm sure, because these are people that can't mass produce like a Joann's or Lions.
And you're paying for their craft. This is a whole new craft. So just like somebody who's going to take the wool and spin it into fiber, this is somebody who's taken plain fiber and plain yarn and dyeing it and creating different colorways and for you to purchase. So this, believe it or not, there's a whole craft to this. So that's why it's a little more pricier. So for example, this skein of yarn is $30, and that's an average price of a skein of 100 grams for sock yarn. That'll make a pair of socks.
Okay.
Sometimes 2, depending upon how length of the cuff.
So some people might hear that and go, $30 for a pair of socks. Why would I spend that much on a pair of socks? And so, as opposed to say going to Walmart and buying a pack of 10 pack of socks for $50 or $40, or I don't know how much them. What is the quality like? I know because I felt it, but how would you describe the quality difference for somebody that goes, why would I make a pair of socks for $30?
The wool. This is a soft merino wool. That's all I can say is just you're paying for not only the quality of the material, but also the dyer's time and their craft.
Understood.
So it's a little bit more pricey, but
it's not just a pair of white athletic socks.
Correct.
Right.
And again, this, am I going to make everybody 31 pairs of socks?
Right.
No. Now, my mom, I am, but because she's my mom. But
not me.
But not me. No. But
I'd be lucky to get the third pair before I pass away.
But just
bury me in my third pair.
But truthfully, in any craft, if you're doing woodworking to make anything, you're only as good as your tools, and this is just part of the material. Then again, you can go into Walmart and get a $5 skein of yarn
and make a pair of socks,
or make a hat, or you don't have to be expensive. It comes down to personal preference.
You mentioned woodworking, and I do that. So it's like I can make this bookshelf out of pine, or I can make it out of oak.
Correct.
And it'll have different characteristics, and sometimes pine's good enough.
Correct.
Sometimes I don't need an oak shelf.
Correct.
If it's just something to hold a plant that's going to get waterlogged. Right,
this hat is acrylic. This might have cost me $8 to make.
And in that case, it's warm enough to keep you warm. It's water resistant. And if it doesn't last forever, who cares? It's a
machine washable.
Hat, right?
Correct. So it depends on really preference.
And take me through. Let's take a little technical break here. What is the online community like now for knitting? You mentioned earlier that, hey, if you're just starting out, go online and go. Can you run through some of the things and people and because you have a bunch that you sort of peruse, and then you have a few that you are a hardcore fan of.
Yes.
Can you run through? I'll sit back and listen because I know you. But can you run through what appeals to you about the channels that you like? What kinds of things do different channels that you watch share, etc.?
Well, there are different aspects to this. So there's the pattern writing aspect and the business aspect of what some of these ladies do. And then there's the personal get to know them aspect. So I'm going to recommend a website called Ravelry, Ravelry. It is a knitting and crocheting website. It's free to join. You log in, create a password. It has got thousands of patterns, both knit and crochet.
Free or to pay for?
Both.
Okay.
So there are thousands that are free, and then there are thousands that, like, again, these ladies and gentlemen have created and posted on this website that you can purchase to kind of help a small business.
Gotcha.
So again, there are a lot of stay-at-home moms like myself who I watch on these podcasts that create patterns on the side as they're raising their family, and they put them up on this website, Ravelry, and you pay to download the pattern. And what I love about Ravelry is they have what they call a library. So they keep all of your patterns very nice and neat in one place.
So kind of like a Netflix or something. Once you've paid for it, it's there under your account. Even if you like don't download it or you lose it or whatever,
Correct.
You can go back and re-download it. It shows a record of what you've purchased.
Correct. And what's also nice is you take a sock pattern, for example. In that pattern, it has how many users have made the pattern. So
Gotcha.
if 200 people have made that sock pattern, you click on that and it shows you, because as you have the option to upload your own project and
Okay.
keep your own projects on this.
Like photos?
Like photos.
Okay.
And also notes. So for example, when I'm making you socks, I will write notes that are specific to you on, I use this needle, this yarn, I cast on this amount, I knit for this many inches, so that I know the next time I go to make a pair of socks for you.
You don't
I
have to refigure it.
Correct. I just go to my page and go, oh, okay. What's great is if you use a pattern and you're making a sweater, you can go into the pattern page and it'll bring up everybody who's uploaded a pattern. It'll show what yarn they've used, what needles they've used, what differences, what modifications they've done to the pattern,
Gotcha.
any alterations they've done, any problems they've had with the pattern, anything they've done, and it's amazing.
That's great.
So it's a community, really. And so
And then you can learn vicariously
Correct.
without having to make the same mistakes, or without, gee, the cuff's a little tight. And somebody on there might say, when I made these, the cuff was tight, so I
Correct.
made this alteration.
Correct.
And then you're like, oh, that saves
Correct.
me the mistake.
Correct. Or
Okay.
they'll add an embellishment to it, or that you go, oh, wow. Like, for example, the mice pattern that I said. I added bibs, and then some lady that for the same pattern had added a skirt. And I was like, oh, that's a really neat. So when I made the mice, I made a boy one and a girl one, and I used her modifications for the skirt.
Excellent.
And I used mine for little bib overalls. So it's great. So that's the start of it.
So some of the people that you watch Ravelry is, we're not even to the part you watch yet, but Ravelry is the place where people would go for patterns, ideas.
Correct. And you can, in the beginning, that was kind of the community. So that each person that had patterns had like their own. I'm the crazy sock lady, for example.
Right.
This is a lady that I watch. Her name is Kay Litton. Mm-hmm. On YouTube, she goes by the crazy sock lady.
Okay.
On Ravelry, she is the crazy sock lady. So you can either type in her name, Kay Litton, or the crazy sock lady, and it'll bring up every single pattern that she's ever written. Shawls, socks, sweaters, whatever she's done, it'll pull it up. And some she's free and some you pay for.
And I know you watch her frequently,
Yes.
often, and she does a lot of different. But when you watch her, a lot of times, like, she'll share what she's working on. But a lot of it too is it's almost a virtual friendship because
100%. When I knit, I'll put on a pair of earbuds, and I've got my coffee and my knitting, and it is like, because I don't have in our community, there isn't a knit group. So if you have the opportunity in local stores like Michael's or in a local craft store, they might have knit night where you ladies go or gentlemen go and for 2 hours go and bring their projects and just knit together. I don't have that opportunity, both time and just availability.
And also, let's be honest, you're a little bit
introverted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for you to go out and do that,
Correct.
You're not a risk taker.
Correct. I'm not. So
we're homebodies.
Yeah. So this is my way of knitting with a virtual friend, basically.
Right.
And
low risk.
Yes. And the way that the knitting podcast's formula typically is whoever's hosting it will obviously give them your name, but they do what they call works and finished objects, which is, hey, this is what I've finished this week, whether it's a sweater, a toy, whatever the item is. Then there's works in progress called WIPs, whatever they're working on currently. And again, they'll show you what yarn they use, what needles they used, just kind of talk about the project, any problems they've had, any modifications they did. A lot of times, if they're creators, whether it is yarn dyers, a lot of these men and women are promoting their own craft.
Understood.
So, for example, Kay, she will knit, obviously, her pattern and say, this is a new pattern I have coming out on Friday.
Available.
It's coming out on Friday. I use this yarn. And a lot of times, these crafters will get together and one independent dyer of yarn will send Kay the yarn and she'll knit out of it and they'll kind of cross promote, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And they're helping each other become bigger in the community.
Correct.
They're also helping each other in the business end of things.
Correct.
And not why we mentioned it, but it would be the same as if Kay did something and said, oh, hey, check out this knitting interview that was neat to, So it's like it builds the whole community up when anybody supports anybody else. I know you've watched her for years.
I've watched her for about 10 years.
Yeah.
So.
And she has quite a few followers. She was one of the ones I mentioned, right?
Yeah, I think she's got over 60,000 now.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And not crazy in a bad way, but and I look at it and I go, 60,000 people will, and I jokingly say this to you, I'm not demeaning the activity at all. It's just the way we joke in our family. But I say, really, 60,000 people subscribe to somebody tying knots in rope? And then I think I started the I don't normally mention too much, but I do another podcast with a coworker of mine called the White Chocolate Podcast, and it's available on YouTube. And it's more of a funny. We play stupid games. We make each other laugh. But I love this serious interview style, which is why I wanted to start Curious Minds, because I like learning about all this stuff, and I have a long list of people that I want to learn from. But you realize it's not easy to develop a big following. We might have around 100 or 120 subscribers for White Chocolate Podcast, but then, we only have maybe 30 for Curious Minds, and I'm only getting started. This is only the third one, but it's still, you look at it and you go, man, to build that kind of an audience around knitting, like of all of the things that you would think would be fascinating, motorcycle accidents or, great baseball plays. It's a wonderful thing, I guess my point is.
It is amazing community. And again, it's no longer the 80, 90-year-old old grandma sitting in her rocking chair.
Right.
It is a lot of youth, a lot of teenagers. There's one young lady that I'm excited to see. There's an actual fiber event coming in Frederick, Maryland here in May, because one of the bigger shows is Maryland Sheep and Wool. I'm not going to attend that, but there's a local thing they do with indie dyers, again, little independent, who don't have enough business to support going to a table with Maryland Sheep and Wool.
You mean the buy-in to get in there?
Correct, because it's hard to get in there.
Right.
So they actually create a little festival.
An offshoot.
That you pay for to kind of go in and shop their booths. And I'm excited because for the first time there's Addison. Her name is Addison. Her business is Ruby and Roses. And she has a podcast by the same name. She started podcasting when she was 15 years old. She started dyeing yarn when she was 16 years old. She's now 21 years old, married, and now her business has expanded so much where she's now got 2 or 3 employees with her dyeing yarn, and she herself is going to be hosting a table at this event. So this is a young lady that I've followed from 15 years old into a young adulthood that I've seen her grow. I've seen her business grow. I've shopped her yarn. So I get to meet her in person, thank her in person, and also support her and shop her yarn in person.
And I don't mean to be silly, but it's a little bit of like meeting a star. Because in the community of seeing people online, it's a star. This will sound like funny, especially to my wife, but when my co-host for the White Chocolate Podcast has a younger brother, and when his younger brother's girlfriend, who had watched our podcast for months but had never met us in person, well, she had met my partner, but she hadn't met me. And she came with him one day. He was going to guest on our podcast, and she came with him to the podcast. And she walks in and just starts smiling and like hands over her mouth. And I was like, what is wrong with Hannah? And he's like, she's a little starstruck seeing. I'm like, seeing me, like, but when you have somebody that you only see on TV or only on YouTube, you think it's a big deal. But the podcasting, it's such a great way to reach people. And you don't have to be a big deal to do it.
No, you become invested in people's lives. And that's the other part about the YouTube community that's amazing, is that Kay will talk about just everyday things. Hey, this weekend my husband and I are doing this. And in the knitting world, they do what they call Vlogmas. And I'm not sure if in YouTube, if most vloggers do it where they just every day from December 1st through the 24th, instead of having a major podcast, they have like a 20 minute excerpt, day in the life, basically. And what's great is you really learn. It sounds boring to to them as they're doing it. This is just my daily get up. Yeah. But it's fascinating because there are different podcasts from around the world. So you learn, like one lady I've watched is in Germany. Yeah. And so you learn about German traditions and food and just different yarns. And it's really gives you a sense of community, even though these ladies and gentlemen are around the world.
Well, and yes, and the other great thing about it is that you don't have to invest a whole lot to get started. Okay. And by sharing, people love. Let's take COVID, for example. Everybody's stuck in their house. I expect that was a huge boost for podcasts.
And it was for the knitting community because people were stuck at home, so they wanted something to do. And they've gone on to YouTube, and then it was like, what can I do?
Everybody started knitting or buying a golden retriever.
Yeah. Or house projects.
Yeah, or building a deck, right. So, but this is something you can do with very little investment.
Yes.
And it's just like Twitch, the Twitch streaming community, and, the ability to just go online on a device and find a podcast about something you're interested in. And not just one podcast, but hours and hours and hours of content about it. And that's one of the things, it's flooded, but to be able to have the availability, for instance, of that young lady at 15, to be entrepreneurial enough to say, hey, this is something I want to do. She could do it. I remember when you started watching her and you were like, can you believe this girl? And she very mature for her age, 100%. very intelligent. The way she spoke about everything was very intelligent. And now that she's doing stuff on her own, you root for people like that.
Correct. She was able to start in her parents' kitchen and start that business and move it from there to her own small studio, have enough money to be able to get out on her own. And she moved actually to a different state because she had basically another option. Another business came in and said, hey, I'll help you. And she got a bigger setup and was able to hire, like I said, 2 or 3 people to help her. And
that's great.
And she's supporting. Now her husband also works, but she's supporting everybody.
Right.
It's amazing. And she's 21 years old. Yeah. It's just, I love it.
Yeah,
if I can support, and that's why, yes, does this skein of yarn cost more than the big box stores? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm not only getting quality material, I'm supporting another small business, which means a lot to me.
Yeah, of course.
Because I'm helping somebody else out.
Correct.
And I'm getting the joy of enjoying their craft.
And you're helping somebody who is not asking for a handout. They're willing to do the work.
Correct.
And so that's a wonderful thing. Is there anybody else that you watch that you'd mention if people were getting started who they'd be interested in? There's
a podcast called Love in Stitches. By Nitty Natty, KNITTY NATTY, and she's Nitty Natty on Instagram and on Ravelry. Again, she was a teacher. She started out doing patterns, making patterns, both knit and crochet. And that's the thing is, a lot of knitters aren't just knitters. So a lot of times they'll bring in books that they're interested in, or they'll have cross stitch that they're doing, so it's multi crafts,
right?
And so you get to see what everybody's working on. Well, she was a crocheter and a knitter, and she ended up quitting her teaching job and moving to New York for a year. And she had enough following with the YouTube business. She actually has a membership where you can pay a certain amount and have they have game night, and they have different things that they do with her. Well, she ended up, her and her husband, last August, moved from New York, bought a little camper van, and they are traveling around the world, or around the United States. Their goal is to get to all 50 states, including Hawaii and Alaska. Those they'll take a plane to.
I was going to say they'll have a heck of a time driving to Hawaii.
But their goal is to, and they're filming all of this, and they're going to local yarn stores in all of the 50 states, purchasing yarn to support the yarn stores, and also doing vlogs about it, both about their
Very
travel and about these small businesses. So they're going in showing you how these businesses are creating the yarn. So how to dye yarn.
So they take video in the shops.
Yes, and it's been amazing. So you get to see...
It's like a virtual tour.
Yes, and so they've done everything from Route 66. So you get to kind of see the different things along the way and different parks that they're going to, national parks, because they have a dog named Toaster. So you get to kind of see their travels, but also learn about different yarn dyers that you may not have been exposed to. So then they link it online, and so you're again helping another small business.
And you
stay
might
in line.
see something unique that I've never seen a yarn dyer do quite that thing
Correct.
before. So it benefits you too, because you get something kind of unique out of it.
So I would say Love and Stitches is one I faithfully follow, and she puts out a podcast every week. The Crazy Sock Lady, who used to be weekly, but it depends, sometimes every 2 weeks. There's quite a few. Honestly, if you would just, at the top bar in YouTube, just put knitting podcasts, you'll be flooded. And then you can just kind of see what's your vibe. So you just click on one and watch and go, oh, this is great. And typically what I've found on the ones that I follow, they follow each other. So again,
right. you daisy chain from one to the next.
Correct, where they'll talk about
there was one that you had, I forget, was it two older sisters, the grocery girls, or and then there was one with a guy. Was it a guy and his wife, or a guy and his partner?
Guy and his partner.
Okay.
And so Leading Men Fiber Arts, Dramatic Knits was the name of the podcast. They're actually on Patreon now. So instead of being on YouTube, they actually switched to
turned it into a pay for...
Patreon.
Gotcha. Which is fine, but...
Well, they did it for business reasons because they started out again. His name is Steve, and his partner, Andy. He was a teacher, and he was also dyeing yarn.
Maybe I should start knitting. I'm a teacher. That seems like what all the teachers are doing.
As a hobby, he was dyeing yarn on the weekends and in the evenings with his partner and selling them online. And they were doing so well enough that he quit his teaching job, and they opened up a small business in their town. Well, they ended up taking over this big historical building, and they're renovating this building to have like an in-store actual person, not just an so they're using the profits from the Patreon to actually
fund their store.
To fund the construction for this old time, which is helping their town because it's an old building they're trying to renovate.
Gotcha.
So
now, what would you say is, if somebody were just starting out, what are the materials that they need? So
there are,
like, let's say I go, all right, Shannon's got me all inspired. I'm ready to knit. I'm going to go to the store first thing in the morning. What do I need to buy?
You need a pair of needles. You need a skein of yarn and a pattern.
Okay.
And so what I would recommend first is going to Ravelry, finding a pattern that you want. And again, you can type in washcloths. You can type in knit scarves. I was going to say, how would you find a beginning level pattern? You can even write beginning patterns or beginning knit, and it breaks it down. That website's amazing. It breaks it down for weights of yarn, what kind of yarn you're using, how much yarn you've got, what needles you want, and it breaks it down. Gotcha. If you just want simple, knit washcloths, knits, whatever you want to learn, or even beginner patterns. If you type beginner, it's going to flood you with free beginner patterns. Okay. And so that's interesting. You click on the pattern, you download it, and you look at the materials. Now, the needles is one of the things you're going to need. There are a few different types of needles. You can get plastic needles, you can get wooden needles, and you can get metal needles. Does it depend on what you're making, or does it depend on just what you prefer? Both. Okay. So, in the beginning, as you're a new knitter, I would recommend getting a wooden needle because the material, the yarn, isn't going to slip off. This has a little more grip so that you're not going to get frustrated and drop stitches.
Dropping a stitch means like it comes off the end of the needle before you're ready for it to do that.
Correct.
Okay.
So you're not dropping stitches and getting frustrated. I would recommend a wooden needle to begin with because it, again, has a little bit more grip.
Understood.
As you get better, it becomes more preference. Some knitters just only knit with wood. Some knitters only knit with metal. Personally, as I got better at it or quicker, I personally knit with metal because I'm used to the stitches glide up faster. So I'm used to, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
I'm used to that. This helps me with speed. This helps me. It's just more comforting. There are different types of needles. So in the beginning, if you're making something flat, so think scarf, think washcloth, stuff like that, you're going to want what they call straight needles, which is got an end here and a point there. If you're knitting something in the round,
like a sock or a hat?
Like a hat to start off with, you're going to want what they call circular needles.
Okay.
So this is 2 needle points
attached with a cord.
Gotcha. Okay. Or they have what they call double pointed needles. And these literally are just what they sound like.
That's what I see you use the most now. Is that?
This is what they call a DPN or a double pointed needle. And it literally has 2 points at each end.
Gotcha.
These I use when I'm making socks.
Socks, yeah.
You can use circulars in socks. You can use these in socks. I personally like double point. It's again preference. Double point needles.
It seems to me like the knots in the rope that you're tying for socks are so small that it would be hard to push around the loop. Is that why the double pointed needles are better than the?
They're not better. It's just preference.
Okay.
Really, you can do the same. You get a longer cord. For in the middle, and you just
have more ability to work.
Correct.
Okay.
Actually, a lot of beginner knitters like what they call, it's called magic loop, is really the style of knitting.
Gotcha.
With knitting socks or anything big circular on this. Again, there are different styles of knitting like that. Mm-hmm. Don't be intimidated by the language.
So you got a pattern that you start with.
Get a pattern.
You got some needles.
So pattern, look at the needles. So if they say a size 5 or size 4, each one of these has, and it calls millimeters. So I wish I'd written down. So like, for example, these are a 2.5, a US 2.5 or a 3 millimeter needle. Okay.
So when you find your pattern, it'll specify you need 4 millimeter needles.
Correct. Or a US 5,
okay.
9.5. It'll break it down for you. So you find those needles. Start with the preference. It'll say straight. It'll say or circular. Usually it'll say knitting in the round if you're going to do a hat. Mm-hmm. If you're not, you just go and you find whatever millimeter needles you are, whatever your preference is.
Gotcha.
Get your needles, get your yarn, follow your pattern. Cast on. Personally, if you want to learn how to cast on, knit stitch, purl stitch, and bind off, the simple 4, again, YouTube.
We're actually going to do a little video here. I'll put it in here where you demonstrate a knit stitch and a purl stitch and how to cast on and how to bind off, just so people can get even just a little idea. So you threw a lot of those terms out. So we'll take a break here and we'll insert a little video of Shannon, a little bit more of a close-up video of Shannon doing some knits and purls and casting on. So here's that video.
Okay. The cast on I'm going to show you is called a long tail cast on. There are several different types. This is a basic one. This is the main one I use all the time. So to get started, you leave yourself a 6 or an 8-inch tail. A trick I was always taught is, in order to cast on however many stitches you're going to want, you wrap it around the needle however many stitches you want to cast on. So I want to do 10. So I'm going to wrap it around 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Pull it out. And at this point, you want to create a slip knot. So go around, pull your yarn through, and there's your slip knot. Next thing you want to do is take your needle, put your needle through the slip knot and kind of secure it, not too tight, but just kind of push it up. Now what you want to do is take these 2 yarns and go around. You have your tail on this end and the ball of yarn in this end. Split them up, go around the thumb and around this finger. So kind of make like a slingshot. You want to go underneath the thumb, around, down, underneath that finger, and then back down underneath the thumb and take the loop off the thumb. Your slip knot is stitch 1. We just created a stitch that's stitch 2. So let's again get our yarn, slingshot, underneath, around, down underneath, and off. That's 3. Slingshot, around, down underneath, and off. That's 4. Around, down underneath, that's 5. And now I will cast on 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Count them: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 stitches. Here are your first, this is your cast on row, and you leave this to the end. And now you've cast on your first row. Okay, now that we have our cast on row, first row we're going to do is we're going to do the knit stitch. So you have the string attached to the yarn attached to your ball. You want to take your needle, you want to go through the front loop, and you want to go from the front to the back of that loop. You want to take your yarn connected to the ball and you want to go around that back needle and create a loop. And then you just want to pull that loop and that needle off. That's your first knit stitch. Again, front to back into the loop, around the needle, through the needle, and off. The first row is usually the tightest because it's your cast on row, and after this it goes very, very simple. So again, through the loop, around the needle, down and off, in, around and off, in, around and off, in, around and off. And that is how you do the knit stitch.
Go ahead.
Okay, now that we've done one row of knit, I want to show you this actual material with, there's knits on the front and purls on the back, which I'm going to show you here in a second, is called stockinette stitch. This is an actual stitch pattern with knitting on one row and purling on the other. And as you can see, the knit stitches look like little V's. That's how you know that this is the front of the work or the knit stitch. So if you ever get confused on if you need to knit or if you need to purl, the knits always give you little V's. Okay, and again, I'm going to demonstrate how to do the knit stitch before we go into the purl stitch. Take your needle from front into the back of that stitch, go around the needle and off, through the next stitch, around the needle, back down and off. And this type of knitting stitch is actually called, I'm a thrower or an English knitter. There's continental, which means you hold the yarn in your left hand. I'm a thrower because you're throwing it around the needle. There's, however it feels comfortable to you, but this is called English knitting or throwing, and this is the knit stitch. Once you get to the end of that row, you just created a knit stitch. Now we're going to turn the work, and this is the purl side. If you look here, purls look like little bumps, And that's how you can tell the difference between the knit side and the purl side. So now we're going to do a purl row. Purl row is very simple. Instead of going from the front and the back like a knit, you're going to take the needle and go from behind into the front. And you're going to wrap the yarn around like you did before. And you're going to pull it off. And you just did your first purl stitch. Again, from the back of the work through the front, around the needle, tuck it down and under, and pull it off. Through, around, down, and off. Through, around, down, and off. Last stitch. Now you just created a purl row. So again, purl and knit. And our final step, and the reason it's curling is stockinette tends to do that, and that's totally fine. Knit side, purl side, and once you're done and you want to bind off, that's very simple as well. You take your needle to bind off. You're going to go into the first stitch and you're going to knit around and knit that first stitch off. Now you're going to go to the next stitch. You're going to knit this stitch. So you're going to get 2 knit stitches on this needle. Once you have 2 stitches on this needle, you're going to take the first stitch that you knit and you're going to lift it up and pull it up and off the needle and over that stitch, leaving 1 stitch on the needle. Now, from this point on, you knit a stitch. Now that you have 2 on the needle, you take the one farthest from you up and around and over that stitch and off, and it's just the same repeat. Knit that stitch, take this one up, over, and off. Knit a stitch, take this one up, over, and off. Okay, this is your last bind off stitch. You leave it on the needle. You take a pair of scissors and you want to again leave a 6 or an 8-inch tail. You cut your yarn. You want to leave that loop. And you want to take your yarn through and pull it through that and tuck it up. And there you have just cast it off. So there is your cast off row, your bind on row, your knit stitches, and your purl stitches. And again, my tutorial is okay. I recommend strongly that you check out Very Pink Knits on YouTube. She's amazing. She's got lots of tutorials, some real close-ups, and if you have any questions, usually she can answer any of them, but if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them.
So hopefully after watching that, people get a little bit of an idea of the very, very beginning steps of what it is. And from there, you just elaborate and change and flip it around and switch it up. What does it cost to do that? What does it cost to get those needles and yarn that we were just talking about before the video?
Needles range in price. They can go as cheap as $5 to... There used to be a company, they went out of business, that had needles up to $75.
Gotcha.
The average box store price, you're going to pay $10 for a pair of needles, and they last forever. So again, it's preference. There is if you don't have a big box store that has available needles that you want, there's another website called Knit Picks. NITPICKS, knitpicks.com. And that's what this yarn is from. They've got middle of the road. They've got some nice needle sets. They've got yarn. So, and again, cotton yarn, wool yarn, acrylic yarn. So it's a little bit step up from a Walmart or
Gotcha.
Joann's,
Right.
but not quite as pricey as the indie dyer. So if you want quantity and a decent materials, Knitpicks is an amazing website as well to get the materials.
So
but
what would you say, how much should somebody set up? $50 to get started?
at most,
Okay.
it depends on what you're going to make, honestly.
And to be honest, you don't want to go out and buy the most expensive.
No.
It's like a carpenter. You don't go buy the most. You don't learn on oak. You learn on pine.
I think when I first started, the book was maybe $20. I bought a $5 skein of yarn and a $10 skein of needles, and that was with the book. So now again, patterns, you can find thousands of patterns for free.
And you probably don't need the book. You can watch it online.
Correct. Now you can literally watch the steps online. You don't need the book. It's a wonderful resource if they still make it. But even if they don't, again, Very Pink Knits, or if you just type in how to knit, it'll bring up thousands of YouTube videos. Click on one, find one that vibes with you, that you go, oh, okay, I really like how they're doing this tutorial, and follow them, subscribe, and just kind of learn that way.
Like subscribing to this podcast.
Absolutely.
Which people should do too. Before they even go searching on YouTube, the first thing they should do is subscribe to the Curious Minds podcast. Ting.
And ring the bell so that you always get notified when the next episode is coming.
I'm embarrassed to admit that for a while on our other podcast, when I was telling people to ring the bell like this, I thought that was subscribing. And then I think you pointed out to me, dear, that's not the same thing as subscribing. And so now I pretend, oh yeah, I knew that. I had no clue. Here I am trying to make a podcast and I don't even know how to tell people to subscribe to it.
But to answer your question, in the beginning, you really don't need much. I would advise that you don't buy much.
Yeah.
I would also advise that you don't go for fancy yarns in the beginning.
Of course.
Don't go
if
for
you're
the
make
fuzzy
mistakes, make it on $5 yarn, not on $50 yarn.
Don't go for yarns that have the fuzz or that look extra. Just get a basic skein of yarn and try it.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. And because there's nothing to be afraid of, you could just pull it right out. In fact, in the knitting world, we call it tinking back. It's knit backwards. Okay. So in all honesty, or we'll just say if I'm knitting a sock and I happen to mess up partway through, it's just a design feature.
Yeah.
And because here's the thing, most of the people that you're going to give that gift to have zero knowledge of the fact that you made a mistake. They have no idea.
Well, I can relate that to what I do for a living as a music teacher and a musician. Most musicians can go out on stage and make mistakes, and the audience will never pick up on it. It's there, but and so in a sock, honestly, anybody who complains about getting a $30 pair of custom-made wool socks that has one little mistake in it, that's fine. I'll just give the next pair to somebody else.
And for me, you got to be knit-worthy. If you're knit-worthy, that means I love you. So,
Well, that means your mother's knit-worthy more than me.
But the just one more row comes into play, as you said earlier in the podcast, because oftentimes we knitters will get in the middle of our patterns and in our knitting, and someone will say, "Hey, dear. Hey, mom." Yeah. And so you want us to pause, but we want to finish the row so that we don't lose track of where we are.
So, and to be clear, each row might have a certain number of stitches.
Correct.
So you count. You have your little ball counter there, your little baseball counter, and it's like, it counts the stitches and you click off. Now, once you get more experience, I guess sometimes you just keep it in your head.
Correct.
But now I'll say, "Hey, hon, do you want to go out and do this, or can you help me do this?" And you'll say, "Just let me finish this row."
Just let me finish.
So that's why the title. I was going to end with that, but you brought brought it up here. But yes, so that's why the title of the podcast I came up with to be funny, because oh my goodness, if every time can you bring me a flashlight? Hey honey, can you do this? Can I have a drink? Or are you ready to go yet? Or just let me finish this row. I said, if I had $1 for every time I heard my wife say, just let me finish this row, I could have retired years ago. So now earlier you mentioned crocheting a little bit. You threw it out there. Can you tell me kind of just this is not going to be about crocheting. Yeah. We don't have time to go through all that, but can you tell me kind of the basic difference between the two for people that don't know?
There is a tremendous difference, believe it or not, even though they get
conflated sometimes.
Yes, confused a lot. In crochet, it's a single hook. It's a single hook. It's a one, where in knitting you need 2 or 4, but most often 2. That's the major difference. You hook instead of it's just a different process, really. The stitches in knitting are V's and purls, where in crochet, it's a completely different look. It's more open.
So is it fair to say that it's a different type of knot in the same rope?
Yeah, it's still part of the needle arts. It's just a different craft in the needle
is there an advantage to one or the other, or is it really just in the way things look and the way what you like to do?
Both. Personal preference, like socks. You can crochet socks, but the way that the fabric is together, knit socks are going to be more sturdy. Versus crochet, you will see toys, for example. There are a lot more variety of crochet toys available on the market for patterns than there are knit, because of the way that the crochet stitches are tighter. Afghans, blankets, granny squares, stuff like that.
You just said something that threw me off a little, because I was about to say, isn't it, when I think of crochet, I think of more open space?
Correct.
But when you said they're tighter, what did you mean by that?
In the toys, the way that the pattern is developed, they're able to be more complex.
Okay. So when I think of a knitted anything, I think of not being able to see through it.
Correct.
When I think of a crocheted anything, I think it's got gaps and openings, like an Afghan.
Right.
Okay, that kind of thing.
And so it's just a different style. It's a different crochet uses a lot more yarn. Okay. So we lovingly call it eats more yarn, just because.
Does it sorry to interrupt you, does it go faster?
Yes.
Oh, it can or does. Like if I wanted to knit a 3 foot by 3 foot washcloth, I could crochet that 3 feet by 3 feet faster.
Typically, yes. Because you're again just one hook versus 2 needles.
Gotcha.
How you're doing it. Our daughter, who's shy, who didn't want to come on here.
Yeah, we wanted her to come on to show a little bit of crochet.
Yes.
Because she's actually crocheted herself a sweater, a shawl, a sweater. I mean, she's done some really amazing things. I'm going to start off
by saying she was 8 years old when I taught her how to knit. She always had a fascination as she watched me knit through the years. So when she got to be 8 and you had the manual dexterity with her hands, the average age of little kids starting is about age 8. You can start 5, 6, but usually age 8 is where they start. She took an interest in it, was good enough. She did socks. We used to do socks together. She did some toys. She did some washcloths. But then on her own, she said, I want to learn how to crochet. That was something I had no idea about. She herself took on her own initiative, went to YouTube and taught herself to crochet. Mm-hmm. And now she is crocheting animals, sweaters, blankets. So she's taken on that, again, starting a craft from not knowing anything and teaching herself just by watching videos.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So what reactions do you get as we start getting to my last few questions here? What reactions do you get when you go out in public and you're knitting? What kinds of, because I've seen some of it and you've told me about others, but what do you hear from people when they look over and realize what you're doing?
Well, sometimes I get perplexing looks, usually by gentlemen, like they watch me, like, what are you doing? And then usually I'll get, what are you making? And they're inquisitive, and then usually we'll strike up a conversation. Most often I'll get ladies that will say to me, oh, what are you making? Oh, that's really cool. Where did you get that? And so it strikes up, oh, well, I had my grandmother or my aunt or my sister, she crochets, so she knits, so I've noticed
that everywhere you go, somebody knows somebody who knitted
Correct.
or used to knit.
Correct.
Right.
And so it depends on where I'm at, but they're like, oh, that's really cool. And then eventually, could you make me one of those?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, total stranger. Sure, I'll mail it to you. What's the funniest thing anybody assumes about knitting? Is there anything funny that people just, like, they say something to you and you realize they're clueless, but they have a misconception about knitting? Or is there any funny things that have happened because of your knitting?
They think that I can just make them a pair of socks in an hour.
Okay.
Or, just make a sweater.
So
just because
an underestimation of how much work is involved.
Yes. And sometimes cost if it is the material. So, for example, some of the things I've made using more expensive yarn cost quite a bit. And so they will say, and again, it's my own preference.
Understood.
I'm going to start by saying you could do it cheaper. And they will go, oh, well, can you make me one?
Yeah.
And when I say, okay, sure, I need X amount of dollars to go buy the supplies, they go, oh, because they think it's mass produced.
Correct.
Walmart, it's
Right.
again.
You can't get a pair of wool handmade socks for $4.99 at Walmart.
No, and in 2 hours.
Right.
No. So
Yeah, that's true. And one of the things I'm hoping for one of our Curious Minds podcasts to get your sister on, who is a patisserie chef.
Yeah.
And she runs into the same thing when she makes cakes
correct.
or cupcakes, or people go, oh, can I get a birthday cake for Camden's birthday on Saturday? And your sister will say, yeah, but she makes everything from scratch, everything fresh. By the way, her stuff is absolutely delicious. I hope I can talk her into doing a podcast. But her stuff is wonderful, but the quality costs.
Right.
And so if you want something that's made better, that's made fresh, that doesn't have preservatives in it, that's all homemade, I'm starting to salivate, then you have to pay a little bit more for it.
And that's the thing that I think I would like everybody to remember. Like, if you go onto some of these websites and you see patterns and you go, $8 for a pattern.
Right.
There's a lot that goes into that pattern. You can get a free pattern, but this is their livelihood, their business, but it also is their time. It's their craft.
Well,
and you got to respect that.
And what you're talking about is they don't just come up with the pattern, then they send it out to people who are test knitters,
right?
Who will
and tech editors
that will knit the pattern, will look through to make sure there's no numerical errors, look through to make sure that what is actually on the page makes what they actually say it's going to make,
or size inclusive. So everything from newborn to a 5X in ladies. So it depends. There is so much to it that you get what you pay for. And it is their craft. And again, with yarn. So if you're going to get an indie dyer, an average skein of indie dyed yarn is anywhere from $26 to $35. It's their cost of their materials and their time and their craft.
And even if you decide that knitting is not for you, to go online if you see a knitted craft that's for sale.
Etsy,
to look at it and go, oh, that's a shawl, but they want $85 for it. Well, that's crazy. I could go get one at TJ Maxx for $12. Yes, you could, but it's not going to be a handmade knitted one, 100% merino wool made out of. So, again, if that's not in your budget, there's no shame in that, but recognize that they're not just making up these outlandish prices out of the air. There's a reason why things are expensive, the material's expensive, and how much is somebody's time worth? If it takes you, how long does it take you in hours to make a pair of socks, for example?
Usually it takes me...
I'm not saying days because you might have an hour here or there, but if you added up just your hours...
close to 80.
So 80 hours, even if you were doing it as a business to make $10 an hour, that means that sock is worth $800 for a pair of socks.
Right.
Nobody's going to pay that for it. So, it does take a lot of time. So, yeah, very good. I mentioned it sort of. Are there any other misconceptions that you can think of that everything should be free and you should be able to do it in 20 minutes?
And that if you give a gift, you're being cheap. So if I give a handmade gift, and I love you, it's because you're knit worthy. Gotcha. And is
knit worthy a term used in the community?
It is. Okay. It is. If you're knit worthy, then we're going to do it for you. Because if you don't appreciate the time, and again, it's our craft, it's our love, it's our skill. And
so it's not because I don't want to spend $20 at Walmart. I'm actually giving you more of myself.
100%.
I've seen you're working on things, and it's easy. It would be easier for you to go to Walmart and buy a $20 gift bag and put a gift card in it. That would be simple. But if you give someone a pair of knitted socks, you're giving them 80 hours of your time.
Right. Or if I'm giving you a cow and a hat and a pair of fingerless mitts, yes, I could go buy those items for $20 at Walmart. But I'm giving you better quality, and I'm giving you something that I've created
for you
with you in mind. So again, if somebody gives you a handmade item, it's because they care.
Yeah.
So please.
Yeah. And if they've only given you 2 handmade items and other people have gotten 30 handmade items, maybe it shows a level. No, I'm just teasing.
It's time, because there's a lot of people that'll want my stuff.
If I can get, I don't know if Grammy will watch this, but if she does, she'll be wondering why. Well, I do appreciate your time. If people have questions, they certainly can answer in the, in the comment section. I can answer them there, ask you the questions, or we could do a little follow-up video with answering questions. I know we're gonna post this in the month of March. I believe this is going to be our March episode. So hopefully by the time this posts and everybody gets a chance to watch it, if they have questions or comments, they can leave them in the comments section. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, please spread the word about our podcast, because I don't anticipate ever making this a monetary thing, but I love seeing comments. I love educating. I am a teacher after all, and I love learning myself so much. So everybody I talk to, I've learned a lot about. I can already tell you, we've already filmed our next episode 4, which is an interview with a coworker of mine that has to do with immigrating to the United States from Colombia, South America, when he was a teenager, speaking no English, coming here with his parents. And it's a fascinating story about what it was like to come here and he is now a teacher in my school, teaches PE. And so, growing up and hearing about what his life was like in Colombia, and then how scary it was to come here speaking no English. It's a fabulous episode. I haven't edited yet, but it's got just great content. You learn so much. That's what I love about doing these podcasts. I have a curious mind. That's why it's named what it is. And ladies and gentlemen, if you like learning, I know it won't be the same every month. Sometimes it might be something you're more or less interested in. But if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the podcast and just tell a few friends, I'd love to see our numbers grow as the podcast grows. We're only doing 1 episode a month. They're pretty long, but that gives you a whole month to come back and digest it. And, and please leave your comments if you have any questions about today. Shannon, thank you very much. We're kind of recording this late at night. So, and you have to work tomorrow. So we'll end it here. And ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you so much. A little cross promote. I mentioned it earlier. If you are interested in laughing and silly games and having more fun, I also do the White Chocolate Podcast, which is at WC Pod on YouTube, and you can check that out. We have almost 50 episodes out already, and that's a weekly podcast for about 45 minutes that I do with a coworker of mine. We just play silly internet games and have a great time laughing. So I love to bring joy to other people. I love to bring information to other people. And between the 2 podcasts that I'm working on, that's what I love to do. So if I taught you anything, or if you enjoyed today's video, or if my wife shared anything with you that was interesting to you, please leave lots of comments, ask questions, and if you happen to go out and get something, please send us a picture.
Yeah. And welcome to the knitting community.
Yeah, post a picture in the links there. I think our email is curiousmindstalk@gmail.com. So if you want to send us a picture, we can include it in a future podcast. We'll do like a little flashback feedback session from previous podcasts. I can add it in, or we'll just do like a little follow-up episode with feedback. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, with that, we will put an end to episode 3. Remember the title, Just Let Me Finish This Row. Thank you, everybody. Have a great month. We'll see you next month.